Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to be talking about how the Reformation started to fragment shortly after Luther began his Lutheranism. Now, while the Catholic Church kept Western Europe religiously united for over 1,000 years, Protestant unity broke up almost immediately, and there were three major reasons why that was. First, I'm going to write on here, see how this works here. First, the first reason was that Luther's successful challenge to the Catholic Church set an example for other reformers. So Luther set an example. Luther set an example. Now others could follow this. The second thing was the printing press. Now why would this be a reason for the spread of Lutheranism and the spread of ideas? Well, the printing press allowed for new translations of the Bible from Latin to the vernacular and let more people read and interpret Scripture on their own. Now, previously, the Church's monopoly on Bibles, all written in Latin, severely limited individual interpretations. Now, the third thing, and our final thing for reasons why Lutheranism split, was that the Bible itself is often vague, so Bible's vagueness. And the reason why this is important is that it encouraged widely differing interpretations, and consequently a number of different sects or religious groups. So sects are a type of different religious group. And they sprang up on the heels of Luther's Reformation. Now, if we look at the first break in the Protestant unity came from a Swiss reformer by the name of Huldrych Zwingli. So this is Zwingli right here. Zwingli. You don't have to worry about his first name, but his last name is Zwingli. Now, although only a year younger than Luther, Zwingli seemed to come from a different world. And while Luther's outlook and background were very medieval, Zwingli received a liberal humanist education and did not have the great sense of guilt and fear of the terrors of hell his German counterpart had. Now, Zwingli's humanist education influenced him to call for religion based entirely on the Bible. And in 1518, he became a common preacher in Zurich. So 1518, he becomes a preacher in Zurich, in Switzerland. I'm going to use the abbreviation CH for Switzerland because that's the official abbreviation. Now, he became a common preacher in Zurich and echoed Luther by speaking out against Bernhardin Samson, a local seller of indulgences. And he also renounced other church abuses and thus launched the Swiss Reformation. So we have the Protestant Reformation, and now we have the Swiss Reformation, which was started by Zwingli. Now, Zwingli's religion was both similar to and different from Luther's. Like Luther, he stressed a more personal relationship between man and God. He claimed faith alone could save one's soul, and he denied the validity of many of the Catholic beliefs and customs, such as purgatory, monasteries, and a celibate or unmarried clergy. However, Zwingli's goal from the first was to break completely from the Catholic Church. His plan for doing this was to establish a theocracy, specifically in Switzerland, a theocracy in Switzerland, or a church-run state in Zurich. So a theocracy is a church-run state. Let me get that on here. So theocracy. He wanted to start a theocracy. Now, by 1525, he had accomplished this, having banished the Catholic Mass and introduced services in the vernacular. Vernacular, again, is the everyday language. That's what vernacular is. So everyday spoken language. And these are all things that Martin Luther was working on as well, but Zwingli was the first to introduce not just the writings, but the Mass itself was spoken at church in the vernacular. Now, he vastly simplified the service to sermon and scripture readings. Despite his love of music, Zwingli banned it from the service and even smashed the church organ. He either destroyed or whitewashed religious images, which he saw as idolatrous, and served communion in a wooden bowl rather than a silver chalice, and even closed down monasteries or turned them into hospitals and schools. Now, although not persecuted, Catholics had to pay fines for attending a church and eating fish on Fridays, a Catholic practice then to symbolize personal sacrifice. by not eating meat, and were excluded from public office. Now, Zwingli also closely supervised the morals of his congregation, and all these measures anticipated the later reforms of John Calvin, who we'll talk about in the next lecture. Now, by 1528, Zwingli's reforms had spread across northern Switzerland. So his reforms, if you look at this map down here on the bottom, Zurich, Switzerland is located, find it here on the map really quick. So Zurich is here in central Switzerland, and his idea spread to the northern part of Switzerland here. Now, he also took a more aggressive foreign policy and attempts to unite with the Lutherans in a common cause against the Catholics. Now, the proposed alliance never occurred because the two camps did not agree on a piece of theology known as transubstantiation. Transubstantiation. And I'll explain this really quickly. So there was a dispute on whether or not the bread and wine of communion were actually transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Now, the Catholic Church had claimed for centuries that transubstantiation did take place, and Luther agreed with them in a modified form. However, Zwingli said it was only symbolic of Christ's body and blood. A personal meeting between Luther and Zwingli in 1529 accomplished nothing except hard feelings, and the proposed alliance between the Zwinglians and Lutherans fell through. Now, aggressive Zwinglian missionaries in the Catholic districts of Switzerland led to war in 1521, and an army of 8,000 Catholics destroyed Zwingli and his force of 1,500 men. Now, an uneasy coexistence between Protestants and Catholics followed, and Protestantism survived in Switzerland. Now, Zwinglianism, however, did not survive, being replaced by Calvinism in the Swiss Reformed Church. Now, still, Zwingli was important for establishing Protestantism in Switzerland and serving as an example for the more successful Calvinists who followed. All right, now our next thing we're going to be looking at is our next one here. Let's go to the next slide, is Anabaptism. Now, after breaking with the Catholic Church's centuries-long monopoly on religion, the issue arose of how far beyond the old set of rules the new beliefs could go. And Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, despite significant religious differences, drew up new sets of rules fairly close to the Catholic Church's. Among other things, they all believed in obedience to civil authority. However, some men preferred to go much farther in rewriting the rules, and as a result, some 40 different sects sprang up in Western Europe. Now, although their beliefs varied somewhat from one another, they have been lumped together under the name of Anabaptists. These were from the common practice of baptizing members as adults. So this was no infant baptism. Normally, a lot of these religions would, as soon as an infant was born, they would baptize them. But these people believed that it was something that you chose when you were older, when older and old enough to know if you were Christian or not. Now, in addition to the Bible as a source of religious truth, they also believed in inner revelation coming directly from God. So, inner revelation, rather than only revelation from the Bible, inner revelation. Now, the Anabaptist movement was more involved with social discontent than the other Protestant sects were. The 1500s saw economic difficulties and resulting from rising population and inflation. Peasants, town craftsmen, and miners were especially hard hit, and it was they who especially joined the Anabaptist ranks and hoped for a better world to come. Now, most Anabaptists denied the right of civil government to rule their laws, and they refused to hold office, bear arms, or swear oaths, which naturally made the authorities suspicious of them. So another thing we call people who don't bear arms and don't fight are pacifists. Now, the problem is during a time of war, pacifists are usually looked down upon because they're not willing to go to the extreme everyone else is to help defeat enemies. Now, actually, most of the Anabaptists were just trying to live good, peaceful, Christian lives in imitation of Christ himself. He did not openly resist the authorities, but they still aroused suspicion because of their different ways. Some groups held property in common, others went to extremes in interpreting the Bible literally, preaching from rooftops and even babbling like children as the Bible supposedly told them to, and they tended to separate themselves from the rest of society, which they saw as sinful. Now, despite their peacefulness, the Anabaptists were heavily persecuted, and this forced them to migrate, which spread their beliefs from Switzerland down the Rhine to the Netherlands. Now, it was here that the movement turned more violent as it combined frustration from economic hard times with an older tradition of socially revolutionary ideas that were popular among the peasants. Now, the climax of this process took place in the German city of Münster. This is where the climax took place in the early 1530s. So Münster in the 1530s. Now, it was in Münster that radical Anabaptists seized power and combined religious fanaticism with a reign of terror that tarnished the reputation of other Anabaptists for years. All books except the Bible were burned. Communal property and polygamy were enforced. Their leader, John Bockelson, ruled with a lavish court while ensuring his followers that they too would eat from gold plates and silver tables in the near future. So alarming was the spectacle that Lutherans and Catholics combined forces to snuff it out. Now, the determined and disciplined resistance of the Anabaptists led to a drawn-out siege from 1534 to 1535, a siege in the city of Münster. The city was finally betrayed and the Anabaptist leaders exterminated. Now, an intense persecution of the Anabaptists followed, killing thousands and driving many more from place to place. Some of them, such as the Mennonites and Amish, found a home in North America. So our Anabaptists today, we know them as Mennonites and or Amish, two different groups of people. The Mennonites and these are in North America today. Mennonites and the Amish. Now, they found a home in North America and have had a profound influence on our attitude of separating church and state. Others made their way to the Spanish Netherlands, where they helped stir up a major revolt against Catholic Spain. Now we're going to move on to the English Reformation. All right, the English Reformation. So as discussed already, the central medieval monarchies at the time, France, England, and Spain, assumed more and more control over the church within their own lands. And as a result, these kings had few grievances against the church and, were generally hostile to the Reformation, since it threatened their own control of religious policies. But were also strong enough to repress the spread of Protestantism among the lower classes. However, the Reformation found a home in one of these monarchies, England, thanks to some very peculiar circumstances. So Henry VIII of England, let's change colors right with green. So Henry VIII, right here. Henry VIII of England, he was known as the Defender of the Faith. I'm going to give you some ideas of his stance here. Defender of the Faith. Known as the Defender of the Faith by Pope Clement VII, was for a work he had written attacking the Lutherans, mainly on political grounds. However, just as at one point he defended the church for largely political reasons, at a later date Henry broke with the church, also for political reasons. Now, Henry had a problem. He needed a son to succeed him to the throne, and without such a son, England might plunge back into civil war, like the Wars of the Roses that Henry's father had ended in 1485. Now, Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, had borne him a daughter, Mary. So the two of them had the daughter Mary. Okay. Now, but no sons. And since Catherine was getting older, Henry wanted his marriage annulled so he can find a new wife to bear him a son. Now, unfortunately, Catherine was the aunt of the Habsburg Empire, Emperor Charles V. Naturally, he wanted Catherine to remain as Queen of England in order to influence his policies and possibly get control of the throne herself. Since Charles also controlled the Pope, the annulment was refused. Meanwhile, Henry had fallen in love with a young woman of the court named Anne Boleyn. This would eventually become his second wife, Anne Boleyn here. Okay, I always mix up her name because her name is always spelt strangely, Y-N, Anne Boleyn. So he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, giving him more reason to depose of Catherine. Now only 20 years old, Henry would have had to accept this verdict or resort to violent means to solve his problem. Ironically, the Lutherans that Henry despised provided him with an answer to this problem: break with Rome. However, he had to move quickly because Anne was with a child, and Henry wanted the baby, hopefully a boy, to be born after the break with Rome in order to be legitimate. Now in 1533, Henry started to break England's ties with the Catholic Church. He was clever in how he accomplished this, doing it in stages. First by cutting off money to Rome, then curtailing the power of the church courts and assuming more authority over the English clergy. Also, he did this through Parliament, so it would seem to be the will of the English people rather than the mere whim of the king. And in 1534, he completely severed the last ties with Rome, and the Church of England replaced the Catholic Church. Now, all this took place in time for the birth of the baby, which turned out to be a girl, Elizabeth, who will later reign England, becoming Elizabeth I. Now, the average churchgoer in England would have noticed little difference in the dogma and service as a result of this break, since the Church of England was basically the Catholic Church without a pope. Therefore, most people accepted it since there was no drastic changes. They resented church abuses and feared a civil war if Henry died without a male heir. Now, after Henry's death, his 9-year-old son Edward VI, the son of Jane Seymour, one of Henry's later wives, and what we'll do right here is I'll quickly go through his wives here. So he marries a woman by the name of Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, who dies naturally. So this is kind of important. In the meantime, prior to this, I should say, Catherine of Aragon, he divorced. He actually divorced her. Anne Boleyn, this character we talked about here, Anne Boleyn, she was executed eventually. Okay, so I'll put executed here. Jane Seymour died naturally, but she also gave birth to Edward, who became the king for a while until he died at 15, so he didn't last very long. Died at 15 years old. Okay, his fourth wife was Anne of Cleves. Who was also divorced. He divorced her as well. So we have divorced, executed, died naturally, divorced. Then he married Catherine Howard. Now the details of what exactly happened aren't terribly important, but she was also executed. And then his sixth wife was Catherine Parr, and she outlived Henry, and she was widowed. Okay, so that's the different wives. So wife number 1, wife number 2, number 3, 4, 5, and 6. He just kept going here. Now, like I said, when his son Edward died, he took the throne, and during his brief reign, the nobles ruling in his name followed Protestant policies. However, when Edward died in 1553, his older half-sister Mary came to the throne. Now, she was an ardent Catholic, like her mother. So we're talking about Queen Mary here. An ardent Catholic like her mother, Catherine. She even married Philip II of Spain to enforce her Catholic policies. Now, the main effects of Mary's persecutions were to alienate the English people, make them more firmly Protestant, and earn her the title of Bloody Mary. So Mary. You can always go back on the slide if you need to see any more of this stuff here. You can go back in the slideshow. Known as Bloody Mary. Now, when Mary died childless in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne. So now we're at the reign of Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, this remarkable woman, one of England's ablest and most popular monarchs, steered an interesting course between Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, the English, or Anglican Church, under Elizabeth grafted moderate Protestant theology on top of Catholic organization and ritual. Now, this compromise satisfied most people, but the more radical English Calvinists, who we'll talk about next time, so Elizabeth versus the Calvinists, I guess you can say right here, the more radical Calvinists wanted more sweeping reforms, such as doing away with bishops and archbishops altogether. Now, these people were known as Puritans. So in England, these were the Puritans. These are also the same people that came over to the English colonies early on, that founded the colonies. These people, since they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of all Catholic elements, were known as the Puritans. Their numbers and power would continue to grow throughout Elizabeth's reign, although she was able to control them. Now, in addition to England's navy saving European Protestantism from extinction at the hands of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the English Reformation was important for opening the way for more radical Puritans, Calvinists, to filter in. Now, eventually, they would become influential enough to overthrow the pro-Catholic king, Charles I, and establish eventually a parliamentary democracy. Now, this in turn would inspire the spread of democratic ideals to America, Europe, and the rest of the world. So this is the end of this lecture on Zwinglianism, Anabaptism, and the English Reformation.